Welcome to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. In this season, we're talking about movement. And today, we'll talk about movement on the podium, conducting and unveiling the composer's hidden message. And guess with whom we'll be talking to?
Our guest today is Kerem Hasan, Chief Conductor of the Tiroler Symphonieorchester Innsbruck. Born in London in 1992, he studied piano and conducting at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and continued his education at the University of Music Franz Liszt Weimar and at the Zurich University of the Arts with Johannes Schläfli. Seen presently by many critics as one of the most relevant young maestros, Hasan is recognised for his insightful interpretations and thirst for intellectual exploration. Owner of an innate talent, it has been through his discipline on technical skills and remarkable musical sensitivity that his conducting has gained attention around the world. His display of artistry exudes self-confidence and profound connection to the emotional core of music, whether through his wide-ranging opera engagements, such as the Glyndebourne Festival Opera, Opera North, Opera Zurich, and most recently the production of Carmen at the English National Opera, or the leading of internationally high-esteemed orchestras such as the London Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Concertgebouw Orkest Amsterdam, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, just to name a few. Among many other prizes, the also former Associate Conductor of the Welsh National Opera has been honoured with the Nestlé and Salzburg Youth Conductors Award, as well as the Aspen Conducting Prize. Known for his collaborations and the leading of successful performances, it has been Kerem Hasan's deep commitment to excellence that has captivated hearts and minds alike beyond the concert hall by means of his passionate advocacy for music education and diverse community engagements.
Maestro, how wonderful to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The simplest as well as the greatest mind in history, whether philosophers, poets, playwrights, or scientists, have been and are continuously inspired by classical music. Music is the universal language of mankind, wrote American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Truth is, music needs no explanation for people to like it or dislike it. And that, yes, it could be even more enjoyable sometimes if you know the background of a certain piece. But even then, you do not need to be knowledgeable to be touched or inspired by it. Kerem, your introduction to classical music began with the piano, I believe. But I want to ask you if you remember the very first time, that moment in which you absolutely fell in love with classical music, and what exactly drove you into that wonderful world?
Beginning with the piano at a very early age, as most young musicians will need to, meant that your exposure is very specific at any given point. And as a solo pianist, I was obsessed with just that. The world of the orchestras, the world of opera, hadn't kind of opened up to me at that point. So for the first few years that I really started learning piano, it was all about the famous pianists And I remember very specifically a performance by the renowned Italian pianist Maurizio Pollini in London. I must have been about 8 years old, 9 years old, and went to this concert and was just astonished. And I think it wasn't just the music making that really astounded me. I think it was also the atmosphere in this concert hall, the way that almost 2,000 people could sit in almost complete darkness and near silence for this extended period of time and listening to the most incredible music unfold. So Maurizio Pollini, I think, had a huge impact on me from when I first heard him in London all those years ago.
In classic conducting, my understanding is that the right hand is the conducting hand, and the left hand is the expression hand. Every movement of the body conveys a musical message, an interpretation of the narrative of each musical composition. To each of your gestures, there shall be an equivalent sound. So basically, there's no decoration, no fooling around during your performances on the podium. In terms of movement, how do you relate to the orchestra as a whole and to each of the musicians in front of you?
So the idea of causation, that a physical movement from the conductor results in a particular sound, is not quite as black and white as it might seem. And that is because we as conductors need to make sure that the interpretation or the understanding of the movement that we are transmitting to the orchestra will be understood in a particular way. And that is all part of the art of conducting. That is part of what we spend many, many years trying to learn and perfecting. So from my perspective, the idea that a particular gesture results in a particular sound is honestly a slightly oversimplistic. From my perspective, one gesture with a certain orchestra or a certain player can have a completely different effect than with another player or another orchestra. And it's these sort of relationships and the way that you can't predict anything in that way that makes conducting so unique. That idea of causation isn't as direct as it might first appear to members of the public or people in the audience when they watch us perform.
And talking about movement of your hands and body, in conveying the message of the composer, the weight of musical imagination is probably decisive, as it could really become its guiding force. We will now hear two excerpts. In the first one, we will hear worldwide acclaimed poet, author, and President Emerita of Penn International, Jennifer Clement, talk about the importance of imagination. And in the second one, we will hear Ewan Shields, assistant conductor to Sir Mark Elder for the Halle Orchestra in Manchester, talk about the mystery of imagination.
The thing about the imagination that's so important, it's where all discovery happens. So, you're not going to go to the moon unless you imagine that you can go to the moon. I mean, without imagination, there's no discovery. So it's a very important part of what it means to be human.
Yeah, imagination in music is such a mystery to me. Composers write these incredibly rich and complex compositions that portray all aspects of life and the human experience. And as conductors, we're supposed to express that with extremely limited medium, our hands. Basically, what we have is up and down, left and right, and maybe front and back. And so I'm always baffled by exactly that, the mystery. And it's almost like electricity or the World Wide Web. I use it every day, but I don't really understand and appreciate fully how it works. Like, that's kind of magical and supernatural to me. And I have to remind myself sometimes about that. And I think the more deeper I understand a piece of music, the more intimately I get to know it.
Kerem, you were talking about the mystery of the relationship with orchestras, but you also have a natural intellectual appetite to learn about the historical background of the pieces you conduct. What influence does your study and knowledge of this background has in the imaginary built in your head while rehearsing or performing a certain piece with an orchestra?
This is a really, really interesting question because it gets really to the heart of what we do as conductors and musicians. On the one hand, the study, the historical study, the musical analysis of a piece of music informs the conductor to the best of their abilities how they believe the composer wanted that piece of music to be interpreted, which is then transmitted to the orchestra. Now, I think every conductor, the number one thing that they need to do is study their scores. They need to know the ins and outs of the music that they're performing. But I think what's particularly interesting, and this is a discussion I've had with several colleagues of mine over the years now, is what the historical study of a piece of music informs us. And I don't say that with any sort of prejudice, but the idea that understanding the historical background of a piece of music or the circumstances of a composition influence the musical interpretation, I think is a far more nuanced question. And I'm not sure I have a full answer yet. And the reason for that is, let's take a composer who's, for example, Shostakovich. Shostakovich's music in certain points of his life obviously hugely influenced by the historical circumstances that he found himself in, obviously being the Soviet regime and the fear for his life and the war and all of this that was going on at that time. And of course, we can hear some of that violence of the war in the music that he writes. It's a key component to several moments of his symphonies that he writes. But in my opinion, the way that the composer writes his music, or certainly in this case, Shostakovich writes his music, tells us not necessarily through a historical context what's going on, but we can hear that in the music itself. I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't necessarily need to know everything that is going on historically at that time. It helps hugely, it helps massively to understand all of this. But I think the very finest composers convey the story within the music itself. And I think that's a really important differentiation to make.
In my head, I'm continuously playing with my imagination. And when I try to picture music, the idea of notes dancing like living entities or a sort of a shining, almost invisible powder that fills spaces between objects often comes into my mind. In any case, it is something that you can feel into a certain flow, and that is perhaps something you were mentioning now, Kerem, and which can often be followed intuitively. Nevertheless, surprises are of course also part of this flow. Which composer would you say has surprised you with the most twists or unexpected notes that at the end turned to be just perfect?
I think it does depend on the piece of music that I'm studying at any given time. I would say one of the greatest composers to really take you on a musical, on a harmonic journey is Johannes Brahms. His symphonic writing is so extraordinary and takes you on such a complex, nuanced journey that every time you come back to these symphonies, you are discovering something new. And it's astounding because his music is so compact in a way, that there is so much information. It's like taking a microscope. You can zoom in onto the individual bars, onto moments within a bar, and find some really, really interesting information about the harmony or about the way that the motifs relate to themselves. And then you can zoom out and look at the way that entire movements connect together. And so seeing that the way that this connects itself in the first place is astonishing. And because the music of Johannes Brahms is really the bread and butter of every single conductor out there, it's something that we all come back to time and time again for precisely that reason.
The next question is a question formulated by Louis Benesch, one of the most respected landscape designers in the world.
I can't remember exactly which fall it was. Not too far, but long enough not to date it precisely. Probably the COVID period, when I first heard Kerem Hasan, directing the Toulouse Orchestre National du Capitole. More recently, I listened to you online directing the Spark Catchers, composed 6 years ago by another discovery, Hannah Kendall. What I liked the most about it was its dance quality. Kerem, my question is, if you feel the same ease on the podium when you are conducting an established classical piece as when you conduct more rhythmic, ethnical, modern bass lines, as those provided by this exciting work. I would like to know how different is the feeling conducting one and another, or moreover, the result of combining the two.
That is a great question. And it is a question with so many variables to it. I guess I would start by answering that question by saying it very much depends on the ensemble that you're working with to begin with. That's the first step to it, because of course conductors fundamentally don't make any sound, and whether or not we are conducting a well-established piece with an ensemble or an orchestra that has particular ties to a certain composer or is a particular tradition throughout the centuries of performing a certain composer will very much affect how I feel when bringing a certain work. And then the other thing I would say is, the question mentions how at ease do I feel. I think that feeling of ease comes, majority of it comes from how well you are prepared, how well you've done your homework, how well you've studied your score, because there is no reason not to feel at ease if you have studied your score thoroughly enough and you have clear ideas about how the music should be performed. And I think the third part to answering that question also depends on the style of the repertoire. And you mentioned Hannah Kendall's work, The Spark Catchers, which is a fabulous work, which I conducted with the London Symphony Orchestra several years ago. And the London Symphony Orchestra are a world-class ensemble who spend a lot of their time performing new music of new composers. So the Spark Catchers was something that they'd not performed before and was something that I'd conducted for the first time. And because of their innate abilities in performing new contemporary repertoire, and if I can say, the fact that I'd prepared very, very thoroughly for such a program, I did feel at ease when conducting that. But that would be a slightly different story if I were to bring a Beethoven symphony to an orchestra like the London Symphony, who have a particular tradition and a particular style of performing certain repertoire. And the role, I guess, the fundamental role of the conductor is to be able to convince the orchestra that the interpretation that you have in your head is one that the composer would have wanted. And at the end of the day, it's all about that. It's all about conviction and being able to persuade the orchestra of your interpretation.
Now let's turn the coin and speak about conducting. About conducting, who would be your or the conductor that most often allows himself or herself to take the most risks while conducting, with the result of bringing the best of the composer's work, as you were now mentioning, by enabling the decoding of the musical narrative, and with this, elevating the orchestra to the point of transforming it into an experience that includes the audience too?
I was very, very lucky to be the assistant for several years of the great late Bernard Haitink, the very, very well-known Dutch conductor and possibly one of the greatest of the 20th century. And Bernard was famous for being an incredible musician, an incredible conductor, but also, very interestingly, being unable to express with words exactly what it was that made his conducting so special. And what I figured out over the several projects and several years of assisting him was that he relied on his gestures to convey to the orchestra exactly what it is that he believed the composer should be sounding like at that particular time. And what I mean by that precisely is he was a man of very, very few words. In rehearsals, he didn't talk much. In fact, he was very well known for saying very little at all in rehearsals. And the things that he would then say would have much, much more potency, much, much more effect. And this was something that I, as a young conductor, was absolutely astonished by. And when Bernard would ask, for example, his old orchestra, the Concertgebouw Orchestra in Amsterdam, for quote unquote a real piano, a real soft dynamic, not just a soft dynamic, but a real soft dynamic, he was a musician that brought everything to the edge of possibility in musically speaking. So especially when I assisted him in the music of Gustav Mahler, whose music by its very nature lives on the edge of sort of human passion, as it were. It was absolutely astonishing to hear the results of the extremes of dynamic, the extremes of articulation, and in turn, resulting back to your original question, would bring this daring to his music making. And I found it absolutely astonishing and absolutely inspiring. And it has been, without doubt, the greatest inspiration that I've had as a musician up until this date.
Kerem, you were talking about intense articulation and also about gestures. And conducting is a very intense physical activity. When you're conducting, you interact with other people through mimics, arms, head, legs, your mind. Everything is movement. And just thinking about the workout when you conduct, for example, the Meistersinger von Nuremberg by Wagner, just makes me wonder, how do you keep up and how do you keep on shape?
I mean, the difference between a musician and a professional athlete is actually not too much at all. And I think that similarity is not made enough. And I would love to shout about it as much as I can, because I think it's something that all musicians, not just conductors, every single musician needs to be aware of at an early age. And fortunately, we're at a point where that is being made more accessible. But it is as you said, it is an incredibly physical activity, conducting, and you have to I treat myself, my body, like an athlete would. I make sure that I eat very, very well, particularly when I'm doing back-to-back weeks of performances or rehearsals, because to move your arms and move your body for up to 6 hours a day in a rehearsal, which is can be a pretty standard rehearsal day. To do that for several days in a row and then do a performance at the end of the week, at least one performance at the end of the week, is hugely physically demanding. And it requires that discipline. It requires core conditioning. It requires strengthening to avoid injury and to maintain physical fitness. And that in turn, that physical fitness, as we all know, affects your mental fitness as well. So my ability to learn more repertoire, to learn more scores, to go from one orchestra to the next week after week is actually dictated not just by how much I've prepared, but obviously how much sleep you get, how much exercise you've done throughout the week, how well you've eaten, whether or not after a certain performance you've gone out very, very late to have a very late dinner. Maybe you should avoid doing that, minimizing your alcohol intake. And I think that, certainly for me, this is a hugely, hugely important question, and something that I would urge, I think, every musician, regardless of instrument or conductor or singer or whatever it is, to think about as much as possible.
And following with physical movement, let's hear Professor of Religious Studies, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, talk about physical movement and what happens when we move in a spiritual level. Let's listen.
In Sufism, we dance. In Judaism, you shuckle. In lots of traditions, native dances. There's a lot of movement, and when you move, the potential. Anyway, this is potentially true. When you move, you start to vibrate in tune with the universe. It says in the Bible, in the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis, that the Spirit of God is the breath of God. The Hebrew is mirakethet, hovers, vibrates over the surface of the deep. So like the earth is covered in water, and the breath of God is vibrating over the whole thing. And then the vibration becomes the word, light, and then land, and all this stuff. The universe is the Word of God, and the Word of God is God's breath, and that's all vibration. So there's nothing solid in the universe. Everything is just dancing. Everything is vibration. So when you're moving, you're vibrating in tune with the vibration of the universe. When you dance, the universe is dancing with you, or the universe is dancing and you're dancing along with it. So movement is such a powerful thing to do.
When you're conducting and you're in a stadium of clear understanding of the composer's message, because you did your homework, as you said, as you're interpreting this message with your movements and gestures on the podium, have you ever had the feeling to be moving in tune with the universe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it very much depends on the work that you're conducting and that particular moment in time. But there is something about conducting, particularly in a concert, I should say, in that performing experience, that transcends a time altogether. And it is incredible how a 1 hour long Mahler symphony can feel like it is reduced to a few minutes because of the sheer intensity of music and movement that is attached to what we do, that is intrinsically attached to what we do. And particularly with certain repertoire, and I think about the music of Beethoven or of Brahms or of Gustav Mahler, I very often in performances sort of block out a way. It's almost meditative in a way. Your focus is so highly pointed towards that one thing, and that is the music, and that is the sound that you're hearing from the orchestra, the way that my gestures relate to what the orchestra are going to perform, etc., that it becomes perhaps an almost religious experience, a meditative experience. And that is, I think that is fundamentally why I do what I do.
Kerem, the Weimar Republic was a period of extraordinary movement and creativity, where composers, visual artists, filmmakers, and authors were exploring social issues, and it became a sort of a great experimental laboratory for music, in which the popular and classical truly mixed. The result was a musical culture of extraordinary ambition and depth that permeated in many ways and culturally shaped the Austro-German Swiss perception and interpretation regarding conducting of classical music. And you studied in Zurich. You have worked precisely in Weimar, and you are the chief conductor of the Tiroler Symphonieorchester already for the 4th term, I believe. In the Austro-German Swiss world of conducting, what is it that moves differently than in the rest of the world? And what has your experience in this world changed in you and in the way you conduct?
That's a fascinating question. I would start by saying that the Austro-German classical music tradition is very much the tradition that I was brought up with, despite the fact that I was born and raised in London. The music that was my go-to music was very much Beethoven or Brahms or Schubert or Liszt or Haydn. And as you said, studying in places like Weimar and Zurich, they have very specific ideas about performing this kind of repertoire. And it is difficult to put into words exactly what it is, but it has something to do fundamentally with the music itself, which therefore affects the way that it's performed. And it's, I would say, fundamentally about the diminution of the idea of the musical motif. And I go back to Johannes Brahms because he really is one of the greatest examples of that Austro-German tradition, where he will take an idea, a very small idea, and I'm talking about maybe 2 or 3 notes at maximum, and essentially compose an entire piece of music based around these 3 notes. And it is that concentration, that concentration of idea that defines, therefore, the sound that is produced as a result. And what you hear very much, especially from Austro-German orchestras, is I think a lot about the string sound in the orchestra, the body of strings in an orchestra is the majority of players. Most of the time, that is. You can very easily have 60 string players on stage in an orchestra. And the way that the strings produce their sound in that repertoire very much defines that Austro-German tradition. And for me, I believe that sound comes from a particular warmth, a particular depth to the sound in chords, that there is a weight to the double basses, to the bass section, to the lower harmonies, the lower sonorities of an orchestra. And I think that very much defines what the Austro-German tradition is all about. And in turn, that very much affects what the, or should affect how the conductor conducts. So when I conduct the music of Brahms or Beethoven, because the music is written in such a concentrated way, my gestures as a conductor are very, very often concentrated, economical.
And in this Austrian-German tradition, in terms of conducting, also I believe is built around the opera house. And in opera, movement is everywhere. You have an orchestra, you have a choir, an opera singers, dancers, costumes, choreographers, a director or more, and so on. And so tell us about all of this movement happening on stage, and how can coherence be given to this seemingly chaos? What is it so fascinating about conducting opera?
Well, I can tell you that it can be chaos sometimes. It very much depends on the production that you're working in. But opera is really a complete art form. And I say complete in the sense that it involves everybody, as you've said, aside from the music and aside from the orchestra in the pit. There are the singers on stage, there are choruses, there are very often dancers, there is lighting, there are directors who are trying to bring the story to life. And the role of the conductor is extremely collaborative in that sense, that we as conductors need to facilitate to the best of our abilities the director's ideas. So the directors might have very specific ideas about what should be going on stage at a particular moment. As a conductor, my job is to listen to what they do and negotiate in the best possible way a musical and dramatic outcome. And it's incredibly exciting. It also takes a lot longer to bring together. You could bring together a very, very fine symphonic performance in a matter of days, sometimes one day. But with opera, you need weeks to put something together. And that is because of the sheer number of people involved. It is because of the sheer complexity of the performances. And it's something that I take particular joy in doing. And it's really a huge passion of mine, is conducting opera.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
Kerem, you've been talking about orchestras as living entities. And I've seen some orchestras that are naturally attuned and that they tend to subtly move in the same direction, as if they were all passengers of the same boat navigating over the ocean waves. The conductor, of course, needs to be the captain of this vessel, and sometimes as big as having more than 100 crew members, each of them with its own personality and ego. And certainly, between the conductor and the orchestra, there needs to be an unshakable bond of trust. We will hear a clip of one of the world's top neurosurgeons, Peter Ceci, talk about building trust and a strong bond among the members of his high-performance team.
I think number one, it starts with the selection of the people. They have to be highly motivated and experts in their fields. And we also have scientists there that use the awake patient as a possibility to learn more about the brain. And they also give their input into the whole procedure. Then I think it's very important to have a common aim and a mission. In the OR, when we are treating the patient, obviously everybody's highly motivated of helping the patient, bringing the patient through the surgery. And I think I don't really have to work much on that because everybody understands that they're doing something very specifically and very unique there. And then it needs a commitment of everybody. And this is part of the training. This is part of how they are motivated and how they see the mission. The commitment is really to reach the surgical procedure at the highest level. And in addition to all these things, we obviously also do some team building experiences. But we go like skiing and mountaineering and experience the nature together or celebrate simply together. I think these are already very precious team building experiences. And I think that as a whole really helps to create this really unique team that we have in our OR at the Charité.
Kerem, what parallels could you draw with Professor Ceci's experience on building these kinds of relationships and a bond of trust in your case, of course, with the musicians of the orchestras you conduct?
I think I should probably start by saying that in a musician's case, it's not a matter of life or death. I don't want to kind of put that sort of gravitas onto it. However, what I can say is that you can actually switch out the word doctor or surgeon for musician in most of what my previous colleague just said, and I think that's true because it's an extra. Well, it's not just to do with the precise subject at hand. So in that case, obviously neurosurgery, or in my case, music. It's not just to do with those things. It's about human interaction as well. And it's about the way that the collaboration can produce the best results possible. And certainly for the case of musicians and for the case of the conductor, my job is to really persuade people and convince them as much as possible that the way that I have studied the music, I believe this is the way that the composer wished this composition to be performed. And it is very, very difficult. I once heard that meeting an orchestra for the first time is a bit like going on a date, going on a blind date. And I think it's so true because on paper, everything can look like it's perfect, that it should be a match made in heaven. It could be a fantastic musician, a fantastic conductor meeting an equally fantastic orchestra. And my goodness, there are many, many stories out there of various musicians and various orchestras who should get along and should be a match made in heaven, but don't, not in the slightest, and simply cannot work together. And then you realize that is just the beauty of human interaction and the way that we communicate with each other and the way that a conductor's movements or gestures will be interpreted by a particular orchestra, or the way that their personality will be interpreted by a particular orchestra, and vice versa, I should say, the way the particular atmosphere in an orchestra comes across to me or any other conductor, has a huge effect on ultimately the performance that we will do together.
Kerem, I have to say that figuratively, we've seen orchestras die and be reborn while interpreting a piece. And those that we have seen, that we've been very lucky. I want to go back to this synchronization and shared movement experienced by well-attuned orchestras. And for that, I'm going to ask Misha, our head of sound, to please play a clip of Dr. Peter Lovett, best known as Dr. Dance, a psychologist with a special interest in movement and dance, and a former professional dancer himself. Let's hear his take on synchronized motion as a shared movement and the sense of shared identity that comes along with it.
Dancing gives us a whole brain workout. I don't think there's many parts of the brain that are not activated as we're dancing. But what's really important is there have been several scientific studies, or many scientific studies, which have looked at the relationship between dancing and what's happening in the brain. So we know that when people dance together, for instance, when people dance together in synchrony, then you get an increase in opioid production in the brain, which makes you feel good. But not only does it make you feel good, it also forms part of social bonding. And this is why when people move together in synchrony, even with somebody they don't know, they feel greater bonds towards them. We know that when people move together in synchrony, they report liking each other more. They report trusting each other more. They report a sense of feeling more similar in terms of their psychological values. And they show more pro-social behavior towards one another, helpful behavior. So that whole thing about shared movement being a glue that bonds people and societies together is really important. You can also see that in terms of people's sense of identity and the way you could look at youth culture. So you look at groups of youths. You can often identify group memberships by the way that people move, by the way they walk, the speed of which they walk, the style of their walk, the swagger. There's a lot of similarities between people. We know that shared movement is part of group identity and social belonging.
We were talking about building strong bonds before and the relationship between conductor and its orchestra in a parallel to a romantic relationship where sometimes things are not explainable. Specifically regarding the Tiroler Symphonieorchester in Innsbruck, what has been the most important requirement for you in order to reach the level of chemistry that you have achieved with the orchestra and to maintain it for so many years? I'm talking about this level of flow where egos fall and music, and only music, is what becomes relevant when conveying the composer's message and its communication to the audience.
I think that stems from one main place in particular, and that is the preparation of all members involved in a performance, and that includes myself. There is simply no point in trying to delve into the details of a symphonic work or a musical performance if we are not prepared enough. And so one thing that I have always stressed, and my orchestra in Innsbruck has been fantastic at this, that their level of preparation for a symphonic concert or an opera project is fantastic, that we start at the highest of levels. And that means, therefore, that we can delve into the nuances of the phrases or the movement that is required on the particular sound world. And I think that I can't overstress this enough, that the very finest orchestras start at a level which could be almost put on stage straight away. And it is from that place that we can really start to do some incredibly detailed work. And then, as a result of all of that, you see and you hear, but I do say the word see more importantly, you see the movement of the orchestra during a performance. You see the way that when we have discussed or spoken about a particular phrase, that we all have the same idea about how it should go. And then you see in the performance the way that the swathe of strings might move towards a certain, physically move towards a certain harmony. And these are the moments that I think to myself, this is what music making is all about. It is that collective understanding, that collective idea about musical performance.
identify when your personality gets in the way, interfering instead of helping communicate the composer's message? How do you avoid this? And if it happens, how do you correct this? Or perhaps, are you corrected by the first violin or something like that?
I might be a bit cheeky and turn that question upside down and say that I believe that it is necessary to have an ego and to have a strong opinion and a strong personality. But what is fundamental is that it works in tandem, in combination with the composer's requests, that the ego that you have, we all have ego. Ego is healthy. Ego is necessary. That it is part, that ultimately its aim is to get towards the composer's interpretation. Now this also comes very much back into the chemistry between an orchestra and a conductor. And you will notice, and it's also something that's changed a lot, I should say, over time. We've seen a lot over the last 40, 50 years, the role of the conductor changing from a slightly more dictatorial role into somebody who is much more collaborative. But I would say even to this day, you have orchestras out there that quite enjoy a firm hand, let's say. They enjoy a strong personality. And there are other orchestras that might enjoy somebody that is a little bit more collaborative. And I'm not saying these two are mutually exclusive. You can be both collaborative and quite a strong personality at the same time. But it's the varying levels to what degree a conductor or a musician presents themselves to an orchestra in that way that dictates really the success of a performance. And the last thing I would say is that obviously an orchestra, 80-piece orchestra, 60-piece orchestra, 100-piece orchestra is made up of a lot of individuals, as you rightly said, with a lot of varying degrees of kind of very strong personalities, let's say. And as a conductor, I have to navigate those strong personalities. But I do so not by going directly to the various players involved, but again, by thinking about what the composer wants. And I think that orchestras can be very forgiving and very understanding if they realize that what the conductor is saying or gesturing, what movement he or she is showing at that particular time is solely based on what the composer wants and not based on their own ego.
Yeah, I guess what perhaps, I don't know, you're referring to is this drive, the drive to go to a certain objective and take your crew members
absolutely
to it, right?
Exactly. It's important to note that inspiration, for me, comes from my excitement, my joy, and my passion about the music. That's where inspiration comes from. It doesn't come from a self-centered place of trying to prove what I know, because orchestras are, they're like sharks that can smell blood in the water sometimes. They know when somebody is not being sincere. They can see through any ego. They can see through somebody who is not being themselves, and they don't like it, and rightly so. So make sure that drive that you have comes from your desire to produce the best possible performance that you can.
Fair enough. You've won so many competitions in the past, such as the Nestle and the Salzburg Festival Young Conductors Award. And you were also a finalist at the Donatello Flick Conducting Competition in London. These contests are needed for exposure and for others to get to know young conductors. What recommendations would you give young candidates to mentally, and how could they mentally prepare themselves, so to say, before a competition for the case they lose, but also for the case they win the competition.
If I could add just one thing into that before we get on to the winning and the losing part, I think it's also really important to talk about the mental preparation just going into any round, whether in the first round, the second round, third round, fourth round, etc. And that I would say is competitions are very unrealistic in, I quote unquote, the real world. You have, a 3-hour rehearsal. You have 2 days of 6-hour rehearsals and then a concert at the end of it. And over that period of time, you can really become yourself. Now, in a competition that 2 days is shrunken down into maybe 15 minutes or something like that. So my first piece of advice to any young conductor going into competition is prepare mentally how you're going to get into, quote unquote, the zone before you stand on the podium, because you don't have 10 minutes to get into the zone and to start feeling comfortable, because goodness knows that's your time up. But if you do have a success in a competition, there is very often and not always, but very often, a lot of attention that is brought to you in a very short space of time. Orchestras will want to try out this relatively new person that has won a competition. And it is important to be able to find people that you can trust. That could be fellow colleagues, fellow conductors, that could be musicians, that could be a manager, but it's very, very important that you can trust someone who can give you an honest opinion about something and about your conducting as well, because it is very, very vital to know whether or not to accept a certain engagement or to turn it down, because the worst thing that you can do after winning a very, very large competition is to try and do too much too soon. As with anything, it's a huge balancing act, because you don't want to be turning down engagements, but then there are naturally certain engagements that are far too big, we should say, for somebody who is just starting out. And so be able to find somebody else in your profession that you can trust and talk to honestly and receive honest feedback about. And if you lose and you don't make it to the final, or you don't make it to that next round, which has happened to me several times and has happened to every conductor several times, it's important to firstly get feedback, understand why something happened. Secondly, I would say reflect by yourself on what you believe could have been done differently. And then thirdly, realize that life happens and that you could have done the best conducting in the world at that particular moment. And for whatever reason, it just didn't click with the people in the jury. It just didn't click with the people in the orchestra. And that's perhaps the hardest one to realize, that rule number one is that life is just unfair sometimes.
And what about winning? Because when you win, there's also important, I guess, to have somebody at your side that keeps you grounded, right?
Absolutely. Keeping yourself grounded as somebody who wins a competition is very, very important. The attention that comes to you in a very short space of time can be quite overwhelming, and you want to keep yourself grounded. And best advice that I've ever heard was from a conducting colleague of mine who said, "You are only as good as your last performance." And that is true. And I think that is so true. And in some ways, for better or for worse, that idea never really goes away. In musical performance.
Kerem, if you were to be the judge of a conducting competition, what would you look? I mean, you've been already mentioning many aspects, but maybe you can wrap it up. What would you look at for picking up a winner?
I think the first and the most important thing to look for is a clear musical idea. And I want to see that through gesture. And I also want to see passion from the conductor. And I think those two, fundamentally, everything else comes from that. I want to see clear ideas, and I want to see a passionate musician who not only enjoys what they do, but can convince everybody else of their ideas of the music.
There is a lot of crossovers happening in the repertoire chosen by classical artists. whether composers, conductors, directors, singers, or musicians, especially between jazz and classical music. Just in this fall, this September, the Boston Symphony, conducted by Andris Nelson, announced a program of American music at the Philharmonie Berlin, where a classical repertoire was expanded into the domain of jazz. A great crossover example is the fantastic and versatile artist mezzo-soprano Marina Biotti. For this occasion, we will hear an interpretation of the Metallica flute with Marina Biotti.
So close, no matter how far. Couldn't be much more from the heart. Forever trusting who we are, and nothing else matters.
I think crossovers made by classical artists are made in an effort to make classical music more approachable and bring it closer to the public square. Do you believe in this effect and effort becoming indeed a movement to bring classical music together with a broader audience? And if yes or no, what do you think about it?
Firstly, yes, I completely agree that it can be used to bring classical music to a wider audience. I should also point out that what we term as crossover music is also, jazz is stemmed from classical repertoire. And I don't want to be too precious about classical music in that way, because at the end of the day, it's all based on the idea of, or the Western idea of harmony, and the way that the harmonies interact with each other. And whether you stick a 4/4 beat on it and put a drum set in there it's absolutely fine by me. And I, for one, think that at this particular moment in time, classical music is fighting in a way for its relevance. And I think that the balancing act that classical music needs to strike is very, very difficult and very dependent on the place that we are talking about, the country that we're talking about, the city that we're talking about. And certainly, in my mind, the idea of combining jazz, combining classical repertoire, having artists that sort of transition between both worlds is great. If it brings audiences in, if it gets people listening, if it inspires people, then I think absolutely we need to do that. Absolutely. And I wholeheartedly defend that.
From the four movements of musical composition, which movement or movements would you pick to dance along the world of music? Would you describe your personality to be a sonata, an allegro, perhaps an andante or a minuet, or a surprising scherzo, or a mix of all of these?
If I'm honest with you, I think it depends on the day. I think if we're talking about Monday mornings, I'm normally in adagio. I think you get towards the Friday, I think we can definitely pick up into a nice happy scherzo. But I don't think there's one movement in particular, to be honest.
And as a complete work, as a sum of all of these movements performed in succession, what would be the work that no matter how many times you've conducted it or played it in the piano, moves you again and again, and why?
I have conducted Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony maybe a couple dozen times at this point, in the space of about 5 years. So really in a relatively short space of time. And I find time and time again that Tchaikovsky's ability to speak emotively, we're not talking about necessarily complex harmonic analyses, but his purely emotive ability to write a melody is so touching, is so beautiful, that I jump at the opportunity to conduct his music time and time again.
Maestro, thank you for taking us into this exciting journey into the world of conducting and sharing your time and a bit of your soul with us. This has been an amazing interview.
Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. To follow Kerem Hasan's steps, please check this episode's description. You can also follow him on social media, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.